A few weeks ago, I unboxed the Austrian Audio Hi-X55, a new close-back portable headphone for mixing and mastering. It's by an Austrian company known for its microphones. The X55 and its smaller brother, the X50, are the first headphones from this company. So I figured we might as well start the comparison of this headphone made by a microphone company to the first headphone by another microphone company. Today, we are going to compare the Austrian Audio Hi-X55 to the Neumann NDH20. The NDH20 is $500, a price that is cringeworthy, and the X55 is $300. Let's start this off nice and easy. There is no doubt whatsoever that the X55 is the more comfortable of the two headphones. Those who own the NDH20 seem to concede that it has a hard clamp and pain-inducing earpads. The NDH20 is heavy, cumbersome, and simply not suited to lengthy periods of listening. The X55 could not be more different in this regard. The immediate difference you see are in the ear cups. The X55 has rectangular earpads that engulf ears. The NDH20's earpads sit on top of the ears, pinching the top and bottom, causing considerable discomfort over time. The X55 is also lighter. I can still feel the X55's weight on my head, but it is far less than the NDH20. The X55 does have decent clamping for it. It's lighter clamping than the NDH20 and even the Sennheiser HD6XX or 660S. If you shake your head really fast, the X55 will move. If you do the same thing on the NDH20, you'll bruise your brain before the NDH20 lets go of its vice-like grip. The X55 has a more plush headband, one that is soft and very forgiving. The NDH20's headband needs more padding. It is clear that Neumann used different padding material in the ear pad versus what's in the headband. The headband feels like a sponge. As for build, the NDH20 wins that comparison. There is no visible plastic on the NDH20, whereas the X55 does have some plastic bits. Notably, part of the X55's ear cups are plastic, as are the two black accent pieces just above the ear cups. However, you should not get the impression that the X55 is built poorly. It is not. It has far better build than the plastic monstrosity that is the LCD-1. It is sturdier than many headphones that cost a whole lot more. The HD600 series are all plastic. The Audio-Technica R70X feels flimsy in comparison. And even the DT770, 880, and 990 staple headphones for professionals have some plastic structure and wobbliness. The X55 does not wiggle, wobble, or flobble. It's sturdy. It's not the tank that is the NDH20. Maybe you could say that the X55 is a Volkswagen. I know, wrong country. As I said in the X55 unboxing video, Austrian Audio doesn't say what the X55 is designed to do. There's a vague statement that these headphones are made for contemporary music. Based on other reviews, I assumed that meant hip-hop, pop, rock, and the like. Neumann says that the NDH20 has, quote, linear sound balance, whatever that's supposed to mean. They say that the headphone has, quote, transparent sound with high resolution. In fact, Neumann bravely claims that the NDH20 is, quote, astonishingly detailed. Neumann says that their headphone is suited for all types of music and is an excellent choice for critical listening. Yeah, well, Neumann also says that the NDH20 has a high long-term comfort, so let's all just take a look at this much more skeptically. I thoroughly tested and reviewed the NDH20 months ago. I concluded that the NDH20 does not do any of what Neumann claims. It's not the most detailed headphone, and in fact, it doesn't have more than average detail and resolution. There were some genres of music that simply did not suit the headphone. For example, pianos often sounded tinny and claustrophobic, had weird resonance that made it sound like the piano was being played inside a metal shipping container. I also said that the NDH20 was a good headphone for easy listening, since it was fairly forgiving and smooth. But for professional work? Nah, forget it. Despite what some hype men promoted, the NDH20 turned out to be less than advertised. But the NDH20 still gets plenty of traction. Let's see if, despite its shortcomings, the NDH20 can outclass the cheaper X55. For the comparisons between the X55 and the NDH20, I did the following. I plugged both headphones into an A-B switch. I used 4 different sources. I used my audeze HUD MX2, hifi Hip Dac P20 with the SHIT Mode 3, and the Monolith Liquid Spark with the SHIT Mode 3. I played music from Amazon Music HD, and I volume matched to the best of my ability. Sub-bass is unmistakably more obvious on the X55 than on the NDH20. The Neumann has sub-bass, but it is neither clear nor accurate. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there is a sub-bass rumble at the beginning of the song, one which lasts for at least the first minute. That rumble was clear, separate, and fast on the X55. On the NDH20, I kept increasing the volume until I was finally able to pick up that rumble. But that rumble was muddy and undefined, melded with the mid-bass. Its decay was slightly longer on the NDH20. When the crescendo hits at the middle of the song, when the organ plays full volume along with several other instruments, the X55 has a leaner, more accurate, more clear presentation. The organ has excellent separation from the other elements in the mix. There is a sense of width and energy. In contrast, the NDH20 has a far muddier, less clear presentation of the crescendo. The organ melded heavily with the other instruments. There was notably less separation of instruments, and instead of hearing the individual components of the song, I heard a big block of undefined bass. In Conquer by Overwork, the NDH20 again showed it combines mid-bass and sub-bass. The bass notes had about average decay, no different than I have heard on many other headphones. There was nothing off-putting about it. The strange thing about the NDH20's performance is that the bass was both not well-defined and boomy at once. The mids remained fairly clear, but it felt almost like I was standing too close to floor-standing speakers. Switching to the X55, the definition between sub-bass and mid-bass was a night and day experience. Where the NDH20 had significant muddiness, the X55 had separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. Decay was slightly faster on the X55. The mids remained clear, and I did not get the sense that I was standing too close to speakers. I listened to a few hip-hop songs including Pure Water, Uproar, New Patek, and Reel It In. The X55 had excellent mid-bass and sub-bass separation. Vocals were always clear and at least one step ahead of the mix. There was sufficient sparkle in the vocals and maybe just a tiny bit elevated above neutral. I could hear the subwoofer effect, but those died off very quickly and did not interact with the mids. I personally felt that the X55 needed a slight boost in the sub-bass for hip-hop songs, a few decibels here and there to start feeling the sub-bass and not just hearing it. On the NDH20, the sub-bass and mid-bass melded. There was a slightly thicker presentation of subwoofer effect, however. The decay was slightly longer. Mids remained fairly clear and about 1 to 2 steps ahead of the mix. There was slightly less sparkle in the vocals on the NDH20 than on the X55. For hip-hop songs, the NDH20 just had a little bit more bass emphasis, the amount that I think that the X55 actually needs in this regard. But in exchange, the NDH20 is muddier, less defined, and less detailed. Kodo's Bird Island is a very good track to hear different types of drums. There are small, medium, and large drums all differently placed and all with their own particular tonalities. The X55 had no trouble clearly, accurately recreating each of these drum types. I could hear different drums in different ear cups and could differentiate between the two flutes that played. On the NDH20, the drums were less detailed with slightly longer decay. I could hear differences among the various drum sizes, but they lacked the clarity that I heard on the X55. The flutes melded into one so that instead of hearing two different flutists, I sometimes heard only one. The overall impression of bass response is this. The NDH20 has muddier, less detailed bass. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is lacking. Comparing to the X55, the NDH20 sounds boomier. Of course, the NDH20 is nothing like boomy headphones like Beats, but the difference between the NDH20 and X55 were immediate and obvious. The X55, on the other hand, has a lot more clarity and detail in the bass. The bass transients is also significantly faster. In exchange, sub-bass is slightly rolled off, or at least not as emphasized as the NDH20. The differences between sub-bass response in these headphones is by small degrees. A few decibel boost might be just enough on the X55. There is indeed a difference between how the X55 and NDH20 present mids and vocals. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, the NDH20 recreated Orla's natural sibilance, if but slightly rolled off. Strangely, however, the NDH20 also made the natural grain in her voice sound a bit harsh. It was a little emphasized and not neutral. The acoustic guitar had about the right timbre in my opinion, but when the entire mix played along with Orla's singing, all the instruments melded. Orla was about shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. On the X55, Orla's sibilance was a tiny bit more elevated, but the grain that I heard on the NDH20 was not accentuated on the X55. In other words, although the sibilance was a few decibels above neutral, the voice was less harsh than it was on the NDH20. The acoustic guitar had faster decay than on the NDH20. When all the instruments played along with Orla's singing, there was plentiful separation of all these elements. It was much easier to hear individual instruments than on the NDH20. In comparison, the NDH20 sounded muddy because it melded a lot of these instruments. In Want You Back by Haim, the X55 again showed its slightly accentuated sibilance. It's a matter of a few decibels and does not become harsh in my opinion. There was excellent separation between the primary and two backup vocalists, all of who have different tonalities. Even when all the instruments played at maximum, all three vocalists were easily heard. In fact, one of the backup vocalists is 1 second slower than the other, and she's in the right ear cup. The amount of clarity and definition, the number of little details I could hear was impressive. For example, the backup singer in the right ear cup has a more squeaky voice than the backup singer in the left ear cup. The bass guitar is actually situated slightly off-center, towards the right. Then there's the high-pitched yell at 2 minutes and 53 seconds into the song, a detail that is sometimes missing in other headphones. The NDH20 rolled off the sibilance just a tiny bit. Separation of backup vocalists was present, but not as clear as on the X55. However, when all the instruments played at maximum, all three vocalists melded into one. It was very difficult to differentiate one backup vocalist from the other. When the instruments were playing lightly, the separation is more clear. Details were not clear on the NDH20 and certainly not to the same degree as on the X55. I did hear the high-pitched yell at 2 minutes and 53 seconds, but it was much more muffled. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the NDH20 rendered the male vocalist's voice quite smoothly. It rolled off some of his sibilance. The bass guitar had a prominence that melded with the mids, but the vocals remained about one step ahead of the mix. It was very difficult to hear the separate tonalities of the primary and backup vocalists. The X55's presentation was, once again, quite different. The drums were clearer, the bass guitar was more neutral, further into the background. The other string instruments, perhaps a banjo, was far more clear on the X55 than on the NDH20. Vocals had more separation, and it was obvious that they were indeed a backup vocalist. For fun, I listened to this same song as it had been recorded live in a large banquet room. I do not know if this particular version of the song is available on Spotify or Amazon, as I could only find it on YouTube. I have a link of that video below. There was a night and day difference between how each headphone presented this particular recording. It was just huge. The X55 showed considerably more clarity, definition, and accuracy in vocals than the NDH20. The NDH20 tended to meld voices and instruments, whereas the X55 separated them. For example, there are little details that just pop out on the X55 that hide on the NDH20. There's a cameraman who is walking back and forth as the band sings, and that cameraman is walking on a wooden floor. At 34 seconds into the song, there is a pause in the music, and you can easily hear the creaking of wood as the cameraman shifts his weight. That detail was so darn obvious on the X55 that it was jarring. On the NDH20, that creaking sound was muffled, and I could easily have missed it had I not heard it first on the X55. Another example is the vocalist singing "I Want You to Want Me" between the following time stamps, between 50 seconds and 60 seconds into the song. On the X55, the words "I want" and "to want" are slightly accentuated, almost like they were spat out by the vocalist. On the NDH20, those same words sound the same as the rest of the words. The mids are vastly different on both headphones. You hear different amounts of detail, clarity, separation, emphasis, and definition. The NDH20 has a darker, less analytical approach. It is a warmer sounding headphone in this regard, hiding details that are clearly recorded into the track. Whereas the NDH20 steamrolls over nuances, the X55 brings them out. Neither headphone is actually neutral. Both affect sibilance. The NDH20 rolls it off slightly, and the X55 emphasizes it slightly. Treble is also different between these headphones. There is less energy in treble instruments on the X55 than on the NDH20. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the horns and brass cut right through on the X55. They were not harsh or peaky. They retained their characteristic sound and timbre. There was excellent separation between group sets. I could not hear individual instruments, but group sets were obviously placed in certain spots. Nothing sounded like it was dead center. Instead, I got the impression I was standing in front of an orchestra as it sat in a semicircle around me. Some instruments came from the extreme left, some off-center, and some all the way from the right. On the NDH20, the instruments were much more muddy. There was far less separation between group sets. The horns and brass has a slight edge to them, a bit more emphasis than the X55 did. These instruments hit my personal treble threshold, and I had to bring the volume down so that the song was more comfortable to listen to. The NDH20 also did not make it seem as though all the instruments were dead center, but it also did not appear as if the orchestra was in a semicircle around me. There was left and right separation of the music, but nothing like what the X55 presented. I next listened to Flight from the City by Johan Johansson. If you watched my original NDH20 videos, you know how critical I was of the NDH20 because of how it performed on this song. My opinion has not changed. The NDH20 distorts the piano considerably. The piano sounds like it is just inches from my head and has a weird resonance that makes the notes off timbre. The cello is very smooth, but unfortunately melds with the piano. On the positive side, the decay of the piano notes is fairly natural. On the X55, the piano sounded easily 5 to 8 feet from me. The notes decayed just a tiny bit faster than they did on the NDH20. The distortion and resonance I heard on the NDH20 was nowhere to be found on the X55. The overall presentation of the piano was cleaner and more resolving, with micro details like creaking wood more obvious. The cello was also smooth and melded slightly with the piano notes, though obviously not as much as it did on the NDH20. The treble test was simply the last nail in the coffin. There is a consistency here, one which I will summarize for you later in the video. What I can say is that the X55 is a vastly different headphone from the NDH20. I have tried to explain the details I heard as I went through the frequency range. I do not want to rehash what I said previously. If you skip to this section, then go back for those details about, well, details. I will summarize this and say that the X55 is a more analytical headphone than the NDH20. That is partly because the X55 has much more clarity, more resolution, and more separation among instruments and vocalists. Sharp intakes of breath, creaking of wood, placement of instruments, and overall accuracy of notes is superior on the X55. The word superior might set someone off. I'm not telling you a subjective opinion. I am telling you a fact. If you buy the NDH20 thinking it will give you all the details, you will be sorely disappointed when you compare it to another headphone that, in actuality, provides detail. If you prefer separation and faster transients, the X55 has the NDH20 beat by a long mile. If you like a more analog, thicker presentation, where instruments and vocalists meld and you get a more intimate sound, then the NDH20 provides that in spades. Whether it is the plucking of guitar strings, the way a particular note sounds, the way a singer breathes, the X55 always brought out those details. The NDH20 sometimes did and sometimes did not, but it always made the details it provided sound muddier, less clear. As for a quantitative test, I can give you one. I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This song has layers of detail, including the sound of children playing in the background, wind blowing, tall grass swaying, footsteps, a synth sound, and a piano. I count the number of steps I can hear within the first 60 seconds of the song. So far, the king of detail retrieval is the Focal Clear, which demonstrates 16 footsteps in the first 45 seconds. On the NDH20, I heard no more than 7 footsteps, and all but the very first step was muffled. On the X55, I heard 15 clear footsteps. Your mileage will vary depending on your recording, but this is not a small gap to bridge. Yet again, there is a remarkable difference between these headphones. Despite both being closed-back headphones, the X55 has noticeably wider soundstage. The NDH20 in comparison sounds claustrophobic, below average. The X55 sounds above average in soundstage. The NDH20 soundstage is less than that of the HD6XX and 660S. The X55 has wider soundstage than these Sennheiser headphones and just a tiny bit less than the Hi-Fi Man Sundara. That is quite impressive for a closed-back headphone, in my opinion. But what's astonishing is how closed off the NDH20 actually sounds. I have read some comments that the NDH20 has good, average to wide soundstage for a closed-back, and I could not disagree more. I wanted to test how these dynamic driver headphones would perform on devices known for their warmer sound signatures. The Hip Dac is slightly above neutral with a slightly emphasized bass and treble. It also has a bass boost function. The Loxg P20 is a tube hybrid. With its stock tubes, the P20 sounds pretty neutral. But I installed the Western Electric 396A tubes, which add some warmth, elevate the bass. I plugged both headphones into the Hip Dac first and used my AV switch. The Hip Dac very easily drives the X55 with or without the gain boost. The bass boost adds just a hint of sub-bass and mid-bass emphasis. This elevated the bass just enough for me to hear the rumble in mountains. It is a small but meaningful difference, one which caused the rumble to linger a little bit longer. In pure water, the bass boost was exactly what I was looking for. That sub-bass rumble came alive, and I could feel the subwoofer effect. It was still well controlled, but more accurate than without that boost. The Hip Dac can also drive the NDH20, though you need to turn the volume knob a whole lot more. Without the bass boost, the NDH20 has longer bass reverberation than the X55. The sub-bass is also slightly more elevated than on the X55. But with the bass boost active, the NDH20's bass became too boomy with noticeably longer decay. There was also some distortion in the bass with this effect active. The P20 added longer bass decay to the NDH20. The sub-bass lingered and melded with the mid-bass. The sound was smoother on the P20 pairing, however, than on the solid-state amps I used previously. I did not hear any distortion or harshness with this pairing. The P20 had a similar effect on the X55. The P20 brought up the bass decay just a tiny bit. However, mid-bass and sub-bass were still more clear, better separated than on the NDH20. As with the NDH20, the P20 and X55 pairing did not result in any distortion or harshness. The point here is that if you feel like you need a little more bass in the X55, small changes like the type hifi is known for can be very pleasing. People will disagree, but I think hifi's use of bass boost is the best of any hardware manufacturer. If you have the Hip Dac or something similar, rest assured that the X55 can easily be driven by them. And you can hear meaningful changes to the bass if that option is available on your device. As for the NDH20, well, if you have a warmer amp DAC or something like the Hip Dac, I really would not recommend pushing that bass boost button. The NDH20 sounds muddy as it is, and the bass effect will simply enhance that. Of course, you can still enjoy that bass EQ. People's tastes vary, and you might be the type that enjoys the bass alterations made to the NDH20. As for the P20, yes, both headphones experience some sound changes with this hybrid amp. As I said when I reviewed the P20, it's a baby tube amp. You get some tube sound signature, but it's mostly a solid-state amplifier. The alterations you hear on the P20, I think, are a little more obvious on the X55 than on the NDH20. Of course, this depends on the tubes you use. I think that the NDH20's marketing is misleading. If I were the type to offend, I would say it's pretty deceitful. So I'll say this: Neumann's marketing for the NDH20 is very deceitful. I have used the NDH20 countless times in the last 12 months and compared it to many headphones. The claims that the NDH20 provides a lot of detail is all hogwash. It's only true under very specific circumstances. For instance, if you compare the NDH20 against another headphone that lacks detail, like the LCD-1, you might be impressed. But when compared to anything that has a modicum of clarity, the NDH20's claims fall apart. Even the $40 MDR MA100 from Sony, a cheap plastic headphone, is clearer than the NDH20 and provides more detail to boot. Then there's the claim that the NDH20 is suited to all types of music. Well, clearly not. Pianos don't do well on the NDH20. In fact, the NDH20 is the only headphone in the dozens and dozens I have used and tested that performed the way it did on piano-centric songs. The reason I use the same songs for these tests is because I want consistency. And with consistency comes the opportunity to find variances. The NDH20 is an outlier in the way pianos are rendered. That tinny, metallic, claustrophobic, and distorted piano sound is unique to the NDH20. Comfort is also a claim that is easily dismissed. If there is one common complaint amongst owners of the NDH20, it is the fact that these headphones are tight and the ear pads too small. Over time, the headband will loosen just a little bit, but those ear cups are still too uncomfortable for long-term use. When we turn to the X55, I have a hard time putting it against the claims, since there are no real claims. I cannot make heads or tails of what Austrian Audio says about the X55 because they barely say anything at all. Maybe that is the advantage of keeping your mouth shut. If you don't make specific claims, you can't be held to them. I do not know if this was a purposeful decision by the Austrian Audio marketing department or simply an oversight. Was Austrian Audio not confident in their headphone, or did they not really know how to describe the sound? I have no idea. But I can say that the X55 has a unique sound. Its clarity is among the best of any closed-back headphone I've ever heard. In fact, it's clearer than a lot of open-back headphones too. The sub-bass is underemphasized, not actually neutral. Mid-bass is about accurate. The mids are a few steps ahead of the mix, but not harsh or shouty. Treble has a slight smoothness to it and is not harsh. The X55 excels in Soundstage, particularly in the closed-back headphone department. It is impressive. Sometimes you have to make earpad swaps to get this type of soundstage and clarity. But on the X55, all of that comes with the stock package. And mind you, the earpads are solid, not perforated. The X55 is also among the most comfortable headphones I have ever worn. The plush padding and more forgiving clamping force means I have spent 3 to 4 hours at a time listening without fatigue. And I can't say the same thing for the NDH20. Strangely, the X55 fulfills the claims that Neumann made for the NDH20. Did the two companies accidentally switch headphones during development like parents getting the wrong baby after birth? Nah, I think it was just hubris on Neumann's part. I said this before and I will say it again. The NDH20 is terrible value at $500. That is an insulting price for a headphone that does not do what the manufacturer claims. And even if the NDH20 did exactly what Neumann promised, $500 would not be justified. The NDH20 is downright uncomfortable for lengthy use. It has below average soundstage. It has no more than average detail at best. It has a muddy tonality throughout the frequency range. It has a treble spike that can become too harsh for some recordings. It is too heavy. How can anybody justify $500 for a pair of headphones with such glaring deficiencies? I dedicated a video about why I liked the NDH20. I said it was partly because of the smooth sound, barring the treble spike, and that's still the case. You see, I sold my original NDH20 months ago, but I bought it back 2 months ago because I think its unique, warm, smooth tonality is hard to find. The build quality is also spectacular. But even if you appreciate the NDH20 sound, and I certainly do, there is no amount of rationalization that justifies the price tag. A fair price for the NDH20, I think, would be no more than $350. That takes into account the particular sound signature and build that it has, but also the false promises Neumann and some zealous reviewers made. When we turn to the X55, I see a headphone that does what the NDH20 simply cannot. The tonality is vastly different. The clarity, separation, resolution, soundstage, comfort, and build are all exemplary. This is the type of build I want in an expensive headphone. Instead, for $400, audeze sold us the LCD1, a plastic mess that requires babying it. I don't need a tank like the NDH20, but I also don't think people should have to use kid gloves with headphones marketed for professionals. Is the $300 price tag fair for the X55? Yeah, I think so. I wish it was $250 considering the X55 comes with only one very long cable. You will have to find another cable that is shorter and fits the audio jack here. And, by the way, the NDH20's cable fits the X55, but the X55 cable does not fit the NDH20 audio jack. Regardless, here's the bottom line. Both headphones are good at what they do. One simply does what the other promised but didn't deliver. Hint, hint. Can I recommend the X55 over the NDH20? Yes, without reservation. The X55 is $200 cheaper, nearly as well built, and you already know about the sound signature. The X55 is not everyone's cup of tea, though. Those who want fuller, thicker, more analog-sounding sound signatures will think that the X55 sounds too analytical. Those who want a more relaxing, forgiving sound may not enjoy the X55, especially if you listen to MP3 or poorly recorded tracks. But frankly, if you're listening to that type of music, then the NDH20 is overkill. For me, the X55 was a fantastic purchase. I have no regrets. And after this comparison, I am even more confident that the NDH20 is a headphone promoted by hype and those with insufficient experience.